Welcome back to the Fishing Road parenting class. I am thrilled today to be joined by Jovan Payes, who we'll introduce in just a moment. But for anybody who is tuning in for the first time, we have been going through a quarter that we call Parenting with the Experts. And everyone makes a little funny face when I call them an expert on parenting, or maybe on the topic that they're given. And I'll explain a little bit more about Jovan in a second. But we cover a wide range of topics each week, some that are very broad about generally spiritually raising your children and what to do and different tips and tricks, but some that get specific into issues. And this week we have one of those more specific discussions about a topic that every teenager will be exposed to and have some part of their life and figure out how to respond to at some point. But before we get into the topic for today, we're joined by Jovan Payes, and want to give him a moment to introduce himself. He has been a visitor of our congregation a couple of times now. But Jovan, tell us a bit about who you are, how someone at our church might know you, and what your current ministry is, and your different passions there.
Yeah, well, it's great to be a part of this class. And yeah, I was just recently at the congregation, I think this last fall, with the 12 Questions Columbus. And I got to teach one of the Bible classes, and then also with the 12 Questions speak one of the nights with Brennan Edwards. So that was, some of you may have come out for that. And then previous to that, I came out for 12 Questions Columbus about, I think, 4 years before that with Tim Lewis, and that was hosted at the building. So some of you may know me from that. But right now I'm in Bakersfield, California. Been here about 8.5 years, full time. And yeah, some of my passions are obviously biblical teaching, but master's New Testament or graduate education. That's kind of been where I've been the last few years. Also in Christian apologetics. I believe we need to make sure that our young people, our youths, our teens, and even our developing young adults have a strong connection to the reliability, or have a resilient faith, being able to see that there are good answers to modern questions. There are good answers to old questions that seem not to go away. I tend to believe they don't go away because people just want to keep using bad arguments. But that's one of my real passions, is that very thing, because I came from a Roman Catholic background, and I came from a gang background, and I had left anything that had to do with religion. So for me to become a Christian and follow Jesus, I have found that area to be a really important part for me to be engaged in. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. The topic for this week is parenting around the topic of drugs and alcohol. And it's funny, some of the other weeks that we've had and topics that we've had, being an expert in it means that the guest speaker has a lot of experience with the subject, and so that's not what we're implying this time, but this is a huge issue around teens that has been around for quite some time. This isn't a brand new problem, and whether a teenager has firsthand experience using drugs or alcohol, they will be exposed to it almost certainly at some point as they're growing up, by media and or temptations or peers or anything else. So as we're just kind of preliminary getting into this topic of drugs and alcohol, I want to ask, in your ministry or perhaps in your personal life, your experience, what experience do you have in this?
Well, this is going to be one of those cases where I've had a lot of experience. So I didn't grow up in a very strong abstinent home when it comes to drinking alcohol, and my exposure was very young, very, very young. I would say adolescent and younger, and usually through family, through social events. but also had family members who are alcoholics growing up. Had my own personal um, use of it and abuse of it in my teen years when I was a high school dropout. I largely contributed. Drugs and alcohol largely contributed to me being a high school dropout. Because it was a large part of the gang culture that I was in. Not to say it's not in part of other cultures or other subcultures, but it really was sort of a daily anchor for me. It might shock people, but I was pretty much every day at school, just about. You could find me within an hour or two of when school started in the park nearby, drinking, whatever. So I have a lot of personal experience, and it affected my youth quite a bit and my educational life quite a bit. When and so I have that. I have seen in my personal family life. I have relatives in their 20s that have abused alcohol to the point where they have permanently damaged their internal organs at 25. And so I've seen the damage of that. So from that perspective, very personal, very both abuser and witness to the dangers of its abuse. And so I think that's the first part of the question. What was the second part?
Oh, and in your ministry, what
In
experience
minute,
you had
yeah,
with it from the ministry end of it?
yes. So in ministry, drugs and alcohol, if we're just going to focus on alcohol, um, I have had members. I preach at a few congregations, so this is not specific to my personal location right now, but I'd say I've probably dealt with a high percentage of members of the church who drink regularly, consistently. And among those, there have been a few that have been extremes cases where, they are alcoholics. I'm called to the house. I'm there when the family splits. I'm or supportive of people going to meetings or going to meetings with them, or championing them when they're hitting levels of sobriety. So it, I would say maybe in a congregation of 100, there might be 1 to 2% of known public cases, and that doesn't speak to the unknown or the hidden cases, so.
Well, and that segues into kind of our first question for this topic. But first, let me just say thank you for the transparency that you're willing to have with this conversation, and for our discussion will balance a lot of those valuable personal experiences alongside some of the more grounded biblical material around it and statistics. But kind of transitioning into what this looks like in the church, which is kind of what you were talking about. I want to ask how big of a problem this is in the church. But before asking that, I think we do need to lay the foundation of, is this a problem biblically? So what does the Bible say about drugs and alcohol? To have a quick study of it to set the foundation for our discussion of how we should treat it as parents.
Yeah. So getting into that question, I think it's important to recognize that there are specific passages that we have to kind of mold and blend together. And I know that it's sometimes easier to argue that no drinking is the biblical teaching, not one drop or anything like that. I don't know that that really is what the Bible says. And when I say I don't know, I'm not questioning it. I really don't think that's the conviction that we need to walk away from. We should understand that the Bible often uses metaphors for joy and goodness and God's blessings with with the sort of celebratory use of alcohol. There are different passages at different times, but in the same breath, there's also the other discussions. Just as a reference, Ecclesiastes 10:12 would be a good example of a state of blessedness. And yet we also see that there are a lot of passages warning, Habakkuk 2:15, that it can lead to exposing someone's nakedness. There are condemnations for drunkenness, Deuteronomy 21:20-21. So we see that part. In fact, Paul says that drunkards will not enter the kingdom of heaven, 1 Corinthians 6:9-10. And drunkenness is described as a work of the flesh. But in saying that, there has to be this appreciation for the positive biblical teaching and examples, that it can be something positive, but at the same time, it's something positive that can be dangerous. It can lead to it can lead to drunkenness, and that state can lead to other sins, and it can be addictive. That's why Paul says an elder must not be addicted to wine or much wine. But of course, we have to appreciate the difference in the strengths of the alcohol being spoken of. Both Old Testament, New Testament describe levels of alcohol, without getting into the weeds on the different words and how they impact. It's really important to understand big picture wise, as one scholar said, the alcohol of the ancient world before distillation, the process where we have reinforced wine, for example, with other forms of alcohol and liquor, would affect your bladder long before it would ever affect your mind. And I think that illustration, or that perspective, that what affected them, even at that limited potency, was still a matter of concern and still a matter of caution. We need to be even more mindful today that now we're not dealing with, prolonged drinking to get drunk. It can happen a whole lot quicker. And so the effects are faster and stronger and longer lasting. So appreciating the biblical context is one thing, and then applying it to a situation where what might have been, let's say, 10 drinks in the ancient world is now reduced to 2 or 1. We definitely need to have a strong caution about using alcohol.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. And I don't want this to be just a theological discussion of it. That can be for another
Yeah.
place. But I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's important to understand that the Bible explicitly says that drunkenness is sinful. And by extension, you can take those same spiritual truths and apply those to other substances that don't have quite as much of like
Right.
a gray area on the way to losing control of your faculties. But there are other scriptures as well that speak of being sober-minded, specifically in First Peter, that you can apply to drugs if we want to take this outside of just alcohol for a moment. But I like how you mentioned that it's important to understand the function and the utility of alcohol in biblical times compared to today. And when we're looking at the function and utility of alcohol in an adult, there might be some room for discussion of maybe positive outlets for it. There are a lot of different opinions, and coming from personally, my family background also has alcoholism from one side of my family. I think there's a lot of strong arguments to say to avoid it altogether. But specifically when we're talking about teenagers and parenting your children through this, I think the utility and function of alcohol in a teenager's life is much more black and white, that it is unhealthy, that it is problematic. And by extension, that it's a spiritual concern as well. And so would that be fair to say, in your opinion, before kind of diving really deep into all of this?
Yeah, I think that's very very fair to say, and very kind to say. I think what really is at the heart is the utility issue. How does our present culture look at alcohol, and what is it, sort of designed and pitched to us to be used for, and then how it's marketed, and really, I've talked to a few people in from outside our country, and it's interesting that there's an outside observation that Americans drink alcohol to get hammered.
Mm.
And it's not something to maybe celebrate something. And the two are very, have a very different utility. And that's more an anecdotal observation, but it's been a consistent one that I've come across. But not to say that people in other cultures don't get drink, don't use alcohol or abuse it.
Right. So that runs pretty cleanly into this question. How much of a problem is this today? Drug and alcohol use in the church. You had alluded to that a little bit already, but maybe specifically with a lens towards young people. I say teens here. I know that these worrying trends with our children are running earlier and earlier, so
Yeah.
maybe even preteen age. But what's the prevalence of this, and where is it concentrated as far as an age of child? What is the age where they would first be exposed to something like this, typically in your experience?
Yeah. So that obviously it depends on what our sources are for analyzing children or adolescent or age groups and their use and abuse of alcohol. But from one or two sources that I was looking up, one being in a medical society, they said in a study between ages 12 to 49, the average age of first drinking was about 17. But then when they dropped down to a smaller category of ages 12 to 21, it went down further to 15. So it seems like the smaller the age group, the lower it gets down to, middle school, high school, people drinking. That's not been my experience, personal experience. I was introduced to alcohol a lot earlier, and that only seems to be either a cultural issue, um, and so that might factor in here. But in my ministerial context, not looking at numbers and statistics, I have run into children um, uh, pre-middle school and junior high-ish, and that's where they seem to, and usually in situations where there's very limited parental involvement, and they are seeing their parents drink or their friends drink or introduced it by a friend, and that just takes off. And the same thing coincides with drugs. And it seems like that drugs are hitting our kids at a younger age, and it's being sold as fun, a new experience, an escape, especially from this general collapse of the family unit that we see in our society. So it's a multifactorial issue, right? And yet in my ministry, it's not surprising, and it has not been surprising, that I'll run into a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old who is having problems with alcohol or drugs, and they have to be taken to a rehab at like 12 or 15.
Mm.
And so that's it's not surprising. Of course, it's not all the children, but it's not surprising that it is an issue in the church.
Mm.
These are church kids, church families.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say that even in a church that you're going to have definitely some percent of the young people who will struggle with actual use of alcohol or substances. And then
Yes.
virtually, I mean, would you say virtually 100% would be at least exposed to some temptations towards it, or some opportunities, or just environments? What would you say to that? To the
Yeah,
ones who don't
I
use
mean,
it but are just around it if they are.
yeah, that's kind of a harder question to answer. But generally speaking, I would say that I don't want to create paranoia, right, with every kid that's in our kids' lives,
Mhm.
but we shouldn't be surprised. Years ago, when I was a young parent, I was asked, "What is one of your first rules in raising your children?" And I was a young parent and I had two children at the time, and I said, "Never trust your kids." um, Let me pull back from that a little bit. It's not about distrusting your children, that they're liars or criminals or whatever. It's more about, do not underestimate your children's experiences,
Hmm.
and do not underestimate the experiences of your children's friends and what they might potentially bring into your kid's life. And that, I think, is a better way to think about it,
Yeah.
because in the church we cannot, I know some try to, but we cannot constantly protect our kids from every opportunity to kind of wrestle with making choices that are right, because then we limit their growth. um but of course, every parent kind of should appreciate where their child is. And
Yeah.
so, but anyways,
I like
as a
that a
general
lot.
stroke.
And I like the how there's a very positive twist to that, that it's not just about don't underestimate your children's capacity for doing the wrong thing, but also don't underestimate their potential for doing the right thing. And um, that if you're seeking to empower them, that maybe that's a positive twist onto this discussion. But let me ask you this, since we're kind of getting into it as well. Do you think the church does a good job, whether that's parents of these children who are being exposed to it, or just the church in general? Do you think we do a good job dealing with this, teaching about it to our young people?
Well, I've noticed that church culture often runs in pockets, right? So we're connected to each other. So are you? What are our youth programs talking about? What are our youth ministries talking about? What are we preaching about? And what do we do when it comes up in our Bible studies with our kids? So dealing with appreciating the variety there, my perspective on that is, um, we could do better. I don't want to classify it as we're doing bad or we're 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 poor at it, but I do believe we could be better in the sense that
Mhm.
we can address passages and we can address the issue. We don't have to treat it as a taboo topic. We don't have to simply say don't do it. Kids don't usually react to that well, and they're at an age where, especially as you get older, they're at an age where they want reasons,
Mhm.
explanations. They will fact check you with their phones. They will search. They will have 100 other opinions heard on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, and then their friends, and then what they hear at church.
Mhm.
So we have to figure out a better dialogue on this. And I think transparency about the issue is important,
Mhm.
because sometimes we've addressed it from the point of view as if we've never had a problem with it,
Yeah.
and yet our churches and our pews have been kind of battlefields for a lot of the older and present generations' lives. So they're quick to see perhaps the hypocrisy in how we talk about it. So I think that's the one key issue is be transparent. You don't have to say everything. You don't have to tell everyone your dirty laundry. But it has to be something we're not afraid to talk about. And also with the context of we're training them in righteousness, right? Timothy 2:11, training them in righteousness. The grace of God has appeared to all men, instructing us and training us, right? So it kind of is our responsibility to make sure we do a good talk about these issues, especially several years ago. Oxford, there was an Oxford book called what was it? Almost Christian. I'm gonna reference this book real quick. Almost Christian. I don't know if any of you've ever seen it.
Yeah, I've
It
heard.
was the result of a series of some of the largest faith studies on our kids in America. And one of the things they walked away with, at least this one by Kenda Creasy Dean, Almost Christian, she observed that a lot of kids lack the narrative of developing into righteousness and what that looks like. And it's we're not that's where we need to do our better work of
Mhm.
how this fits into being a Christian, godliness, sober-mindedness. And so there's that issue. But also really dealing with the issue, and I'm going to pull from personal ministry experiences. There's a lot of stigma connected to in different pockets. I think a lot of congregations, there are a lot of churches that I've been around that have 12-step programs, maybe Celebrate Recovery,
Yeah.
maybe an alternative program to that. And some places actually have counseling centers in their church, which, for a congregation to have those kinds of tools is wonderful. Well, the average rank and file church that usually doesn't have those resources, they often shy away from hosting some kind of uh, uh, redemptive program to get through it while keeping your faith
Yeah.
and feeling that your problems are not insurmountable and will not isolate you from God's people.
Hmm.
And so that's the area I think that is our most troubling spot in treating and dealing with people, especially our young people who might stumble into an addiction. When I was a high schooler, meth was just coming on the scene. Now we have kids who are lacing candies with fentanyl, and it's incredible the proliferation of drug use and alcohol among our middle schoolers and our high schoolers. Even when I was, for example, at my college that I went to, the local grocery store manager was on the news for using his position to hire high school cashier students to infiltrate high schools.
Wow.
So we have to appreciate that this is not happening in a vacuum. Our kids are being are prey to people who want to make money off this, and that includes big business, and that includes illegal business. And so as it comes to the church, we've had an experience where one kid constantly he got so wrapped up in drugs that he ended up going to jail. He got to a point that he preferred to stay in jail because at least he was clean, sober minded, and can worship God without inhibition.
Wow.
He said, please let me stay here,
Hmm.
because he tried all the other programs and he tried overnight programs. So I've seen the extreme cases, and I've seen cases where kids, they're just trying it, they get kind of caught up and they kind of wake up.
Mhm.
And we just have to be there for them and let them know that, okay, this is a real problem, this is a real danger. You're really messing with the Kool-Aid here. You're messing with the batter. It hasn't fully cooked, and we need to help you through this. And that's this place where they can struggle with accountability, but also as included in the body of Christ, not pariah. They're not lepers. They're struggling. And that's where I think the area of compassion and support without looking at recovery programs with stigma.
Yeah. So, and kind of to summarize a few of the things that you said, and let me know if I'm getting this right. I hear you kind of put it into three different camps. The first being that as parents and as churches, we can do a better job explaining why the church or the Bible talks about this as much as it does, because it does talk quite a bit about the dangers of alcohol. You read through the Proverbs, and it speaks at length about the dangers of drunkenness and everything like that. And instead of just saying don't, being able to explain why is important and helpful for young people. But more than that, as parents, being able to model and reflect appropriate behavior, I think was a point that you had brought up. And actually, one of the recurring themes of our parenting class has been our own modeling and how confusing it has to be for teenagers, especially if they're hearing something at church that says, don't touch alcohol, and they're hearing a similar command from their parents, but then, they see their parents living a different lifestyle, that would be,
Yeah.
just tremendously confusing. So modeling as a parent is very important, but then also modeling as a congregation for the path of redemption and making that comfortable, making that something that they shouldn't feel ashamed of, and whether that is making sure your congregation has programming or just the right mindset. And I think congregations of different sizes, can feel obligated maybe to have some kind of programming, and of course, if they can't, then to have the right mindset around redemption. But is that a fair kind of summarization to explain the why, to model as parents, and have the right culture around repentance as a church?
Yeah, yeah, you summarized it well. And I would add, perhaps, maybe not as another category, but I would add that a thing we have to be mindful of is the drug community and the drinking community, if I can call them that, are often more inclusive, supportive, because a lot of those people, they don't want to be stuck in that either. As someone who took a year to detox as a young teenager who wanted to follow Jesus, I found myself surrounded by a lot of other older teens who were trying to do the same thing but couldn't. Sometimes the church is not the safest place for them. And I'm saying that language because we have to be. We can be compassionate without compromising the truth on these issues.
And I think
that's
especially from a parenting standpoint, that
right.
not every parent has control over the culture of their congregation. Hopefully every parent attends a church where they can talk to their elders if they're uncomfortable with a part of the culture. But if they can't, they can make sure that their house is that safe place that you're talking
Right.
about.
Yes.
And that kind of segues into the final question. And for time's sake,
Okay.
we're gonna move past this one that says, what are some of the social, developmental, or spiritual issues with teens and substance abuse? I think there's a lot of research out there. It's very conclusive that there is social and developmental issues if you're exposed to alcohol. That I don't think we
Let me
really.
say one thing
Oh,
real quick
yeah,
about
yeah, please.
So there's the great book. It's very old now, but a great book called A Tribe Apart, by Patricia Hirsch. Is that right? Yeah, Hirsch. I have it right here with me. Read it a long time ago. And we have to appreciate that they're in this part of their life where they're riding this fence, they're still home, and they're trying to create their own universe. They're trying to create their own world by making new friends and new connections outside of their home, if that appeals to them. And putting alcohol, drugs, and all that other stuff in there definitely affects them. socially, developmentally. It affects the brain, it affects the nervous system, it affects your lungs, it affects your normal, kidney function, your liver function. There's not a part of, I think, your 7 organic bodily skeletal system, like, it affects everything. And especially at a time when they're just forming, they're still developing, they're not even mature. um and that's a thing they don't appreciate, but that's a thing that we as adults and church leaders are very aware of. And so that, I don't know if that is more of a foundational understanding that leaders need to have, because that may not be a pool for our kids. Like, I don't care, I'm young, I'll get better, they don't know anything except they heal quickly. um they break a bone, it'll be, good in like a few weeks. They don't know anything except that kind of resilience. They don't appreciate what it's like when you're living in the aftermath.
Right. And that goes back to explaining the why behind this command, that there are really physical and just natural logical reasons to avoid this type of thing, in addition to all of the spiritual reasons that are provided in scripture. But this is our last question. And so I want to finish our
Okay.
discussion with just this and really unpack what you think the best advice would be. What do parents need to keep in mind when dealing with this issue?
So first thing, you have to start this battle or strategy as soon as possible. The moment they're in your arms the first time, you should be already committed to the idea that you're going to be this kid's shepherd. Like, you're going to shepherd them in the way they should go. So that is a primary, like primary colors. That's primary to a parent's role. You cannot make your role, uh, as temporary as you have time, and then say, well, we have support systems like school and church and youth leaders and all this stuff. You cannot. You need to view them as your helpers, not you their helpers. Secondly, I really want to stress the importance of casually creating a culture of conversation over the years. Build a legacy, a relationship with your kids that, even if they're embarrassed by the things they're going through or the temptations they are going through, you created enough credibility with them that they can come to you. I've heard worst case stories where I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't even go to your parent, um but then there are other cases where they have good parents. Like, their kids, they go, my mom and my dad, they're good people, but man, I can't talk to them. So it's important to lay the groundwork now, showing them that they will never earn more levels of your love by their behavior. You may respond to them based on bad behavior, but that is never about that your love has fluctuated. Okay. And so you build a legacy like that with them, and that will create and provide for you at least a few, if not a lot, of chances to help navigate or speak to them when their behavior is going awry. And especially when they come to a place where, for a window of time, they might go, don't preach to me. I'm like, I got nothing else but to preach to you. And there have been a lot more things before preaching to you that I've been doing. This is who we are, and your temptations are real, your desires are real. And I think that's the other thing. Don't immediately invalidate them just because morally we know it's wrong or questionable. In other words, they've obviously found something of value to them, whether it's exploration, whether it's experience, fun, something. Hebrews 11 tells us that Moses left the pleasures of sin and chose to suffer with the people of God. Sin is pleasurable. It's fun. It can connect deeply with people. So it's not sufficient in the dialogue to invalidate their interests. You have to talk to them in a way where you may want to strangle them in your heart because they're doing things that you never taught them to do. But at the end of the day, parenting is not about control. It's about guidance. And that's what we have to keep doing. We're a guide. We're a guide. We're a guide. And if they want to go off the beaten path of God's word, we need to at least teach them to leave breadcrumbs so we can help find them, or stand where they've parted and wait for them to come back or go after them. And I think I want to end with that.
Well, Jovan, thank you so much. That's all the time that we had, but I feel like we could keep talking about this for a while. I appreciate your time very much, and would love to see you back in Columbus sometime.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll be praying for your class, and I hope and pray that what we talked about will be beneficial to those listening, and may God bless us with raising of these young, precious souls.
All right. Thank you.